Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Tesseract. This is episode number 3. I'm Augustus. My co-host Josh is here, and our second co-host is Prashant, who is sick today. He's not going to be able to make it. Today's guest is Nick Cook. Welcome to the show, Nick. Josh, if you want to maybe give a brief introduction of Nick, and we can get started.
Sure. Hey, Nick, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Josh. How are you guys?
Awesome.
Fantastic.
I'll just introduce you for a sec. This is Nick Cook. He's the author of The Hunt for Zero Point, among other books. He was the aviation editor of Jane's Defense Weekly, and I met him a few years ago at a conference at MIT for propulsion. And Nick is an English person, and I don't know if that's good, Nick. I just kind of wanted to have you talk a bit.
That's perfect, Josh. Technically, I'm quarter English, quarter Scots, quarter Welsh, and quarter American. I have had an American grandmother, so that makes me a bit of a dog's dinner. But everything else you got spot on. Well, what else can I say about myself? You mentioned Jane's Defense Weekly. I was the aviation editor there for about 15 years. I joined in 1986. It was an interesting time because things were happening in the world of secrets. The Reagan administration had just basically boosted defense spending in a bid to bring down the Soviet Union, which in effect it did. And part of that spending package was to introduce a massive injection of what's called black world funding into the defense budget. And black world funding describes secret, unaccountable slushes of money which go towards top secret programs. And at the time, so think sort of mid to late 80s, there were some very sort of interesting rumors in our world. I mean, me as a defense journalist, about aircraft particularly seen over the desert southwest of America that could not be accounted for in terms of what was known to be out there. So people like me started to get quite interested in all of this. And, we rapidly found out that there were a raft of programs, secret programs, some of which came to the light of day at the end of the decade. So I think in 1988, the outgoing then Reagan administration revealed that it had been building, I think it was 50 odd stealth fighters in secret. A great deal of that number had by then gone into squadron service in Nevada at a base called Tonopah in secret. And this was sort of just what I felt at the time was the tip of a giant iceberg. If this stuff was going on and had been admitted to in 1988 after a decade of cover-up, what else was going on in the black world that had not been revealed? And so with that sort of teasing question at the back of my mind, I then went on, and Josh, you mentioned it, to research what became a book called The Hunt for Zero Point, which really at the outset posed a question, or at least I posed a question to myself, which was, given all of this secrecy, what is the deepest, darkest secret I could possibly conceive of in the 1990 odd timeframe that the Department of Defense might be concealing? And I came to the conclusion that it was probably around a breakthrough form of propulsion, to wit, in populist terms, anti-gravity. So could the US, and I focused on the US because that was where the most interesting stuff was going on, could the US have developed something deeply secret in the black that looked a lot like a UFO. Because, as we all know, there had been and continue to be reports all over the world of unidentified flying objects. And I thought it was a kind of decent proposition to propose as the start point of a journey. But I also knew that it was deeply taboo, and it's kind of hard to appreciate that now. I mean, so much has been relaxed in the UFO world. People talk about it. I mean, even in the company I keep, engineers in the aerospace world now talk about UFOs and anti-gravity. But back then, if I breathed the word anti-gravity on my circuit, I would have been out of a job. So I had to keep this whole thing very, very secret. And it really kicked off the start of a journey in 1990. And by the end of that decade, so sort of 1999, I knew that I had the material for a book. I wrote the book. The book came out in 2001 here in the UK and 2002 in the US. And I'm thrilled to say it's probably become more relevant now, and that I talk about it more now than I did when it came out. So it's had a lot of life. It continues to have legs, and I hope we can talk a bit more about it today.
Yeah, for sure. My first question for you actually is revolved around the anti-gravitics, the G engines, the anti-gravity propulsion systems. So with Tesseract, we've dove pretty deep into the idea of a precognitive sentient phenomenon as one of the best ways to describe things like the Tic Tac incident with the Tic Tac UFO. The Tic Tac UFO seemed to have been capable of knowing where the pilots were going to be before they did. The Tic Tac vanishes at the snap of a finger, ends up at a secret location when the pilots that were chasing it wanted to rendezvous. They went to the secret location just to find the Tic Tac waiting there. So the big question was this thing able to hack our communications, or was it able to actually know prior, having the sense of knowing? So the question I have is, so these G engines, these gravity engines, are said to manipulate space-time. Do you think that these crafts with the G engine technology are able to actually not only manipulate space, but also manipulate time? And are we responsible potentially, from any knowledge you might have into these programs, that these crafts are potentially actually being created in the future and are coming back in time, or able to, manipulate time in any fashion? What do you think of that?
Well, there's a load to unpick and unpack there, but all of those questions get to the heart of the whole issue, if you ask me. I mean, what started out for me back in 1990 as a kind of nuts and bolts investigation into technology, in essence, has now, whatever that is, 30 years later, morphed into a much bigger question about the phenomenon that we're dealing with. And I mean, the Tic Tac incident is a very good case study, because, as you rightly mentioned, what had happened was the F-18s off the carrier Nimitz had gone into the combat training zone where these aircraft were going to carry out some maneuvers. All of this, I should preface, took place in 2004. And when they entered that air combat training box, and they spotted this Tic Tac looking object, which was about the size of one of their F-18s, low down over the water. As you said, it, first of all, as they, or at least one of the pilots circled down to investigate it, it circled back up as if it was engaging it in combat. It then accelerated at a phenomenal speed and was next spotted on radar at what is called the CAP point, the Combat Air Patrol Point, which is technically it's a secret set of coordinates inside that air maneuver box that is only known to a handful of people. I don't even think the pilots know where the CAP point is before it is given to them, or given to them over the radio. So this thing knew exactly where to go. Now, how did it do that? Could it hack into, as you mentioned, into their comm systems, into their computer systems to know where that CAP point is or was? Unlikely, in my view. I think those are encrypted to such a degree that it would be incredibly hard to do that. So what other possibilities are you left with? If you are dealing with an object, a vehicle that flies in the way that it does, and from all the descriptions that we have of it, it is maneuvering in a way that, the pilots themselves said it defied physics. So in some way it is doing things that can't be done with conventional aircraft. Then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it doing? And I think you have to go to the next proposition, which is that it is in some way manipulating space. And of course, Einsteinian physics tell us that if you manipulate space, you're also manipulating time and gravity. So you are bending and now warping reality, the fabric of existence, in ways that defy our comprehension. But I think that, at this point, what you're looking to do is search for an Occam's razor explanation for what is going on. And as bizarre as it sounds, Occam's razor for me, which is obviously the simplest explanation for what the evidence is telling you, Occam's razor is that this thing is a craft that is not employing current terrestrial technology, but is doing something truly extraordinary, which is bending the fabric of space-time in some way, shape, or form. And there are conceivably ways that you can do that technologically. There is a physicist based in San Francisco. He's, I hope you won't mind me saying this, he's about 80 now, but he's a guy with a very strong track record in space-time metric engineering, and his name is Dr. Jack Sarfati. And Jack maintains that the Tic Tac has what is called a metamaterial hull, which is a hull that is composed of tiny waveguides, so minuscule that they are able to manipulate the fabric of reality, in essence. And so using this technology, it would, Jack maintains, be able to come back from the past to the present. And of course, if you can do that, you know exactly where the cap point of those aircraft is going to be because you're coming from the future. So it opens up a realm of possibility, and needless to say, also opens up a plethora of new questions. So, on to the next one, Josh. What have you got for me next?
Last night I was reading Chapter 9 of The Hunt for Zero Point, where you fly into Huntsville and then you go meet somebody at Von Braun's complex area, and then you talk about how you go up to what is it? Maybe Ohio or
Cleveland. I think I seem to remember Cleveland, Ohio. NASA, Cleveland. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk more about that? Well,
I can talk. I can talk about them both. Actually, Cleveland wasn't so interesting, but let's talk about NASA Huntsville first. That, as you say, was the part of NASA that was given over to rocketry. So it was sort of pretty much founded. In fact, as you walk into Huntsville Airport, there used to be, I don't know whether there still is, a giant kind of cutout of Werner von Braun, who was the Germans' rocket genius during the Second World War. And he's sort of waving and welcoming you to Huntsville. It's a bit strange for me, a Brit, because Werner von Braun's rockets landed in quite some numbers on London. And even when I was growing up, you could see craters still in London where these V2s had sort of hit the city and blasted great holes in it. But that aside, Huntsville and the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center was a very interesting place where not only were they then, I mean, when was this? 1996, I think, or 97, maybe I visited. And it was not only where they were testing, space shuttle engines and other rockets, but were also looking at very advanced spaceflight concepts. They had a goal at the time to make a 50-year journey to the nearest star system, which might sound like a really long time, but actually, under current chemical rocket propulsion technology, would take, hundreds of thousands of years. So they to do something different, they were looking at some very advanced concepts like space warp, all manner of kind of space-time engineering to get to the nearest star system. So really taking NASA then into UFO territory. But again, very different world then than it is now. Whilst all of these people were alluding to UFO type technology back then, they daren't mention the word. And this is what has been so liberating about the last 5 years, since the New York Times in 2017 blew the lid off up till then a secret unit within the Pentagon called ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which had been studying UFOs. And when you've got an august paper like the New York Times talking about UFOs, suddenly, a whole load of people I knew, began to realize that it was okay to start talking about this stuff in a way that it had not been before. And actually, I was one of them. I had completely, after The Hunt for Zero Point came out, I talked about it for a year or two, and then I went on to other stuff. I'm a writer and I'm a technology consultant, so I sort of left it behind. But then in 2017, it all came screaming back again. And I was one of those people who felt liberated enough to be able to talk about this stuff very openly, which I still do. And more than that, to really dive down the rabbit hole to the degree that, conventional explanations for what we see in the sky and people report as UFOs is no longer for me about a nuts and bolts discussion, about whether, crudely speaking, if you picked a brick up and you threw the brick at a low hovering UFO, the question is, would it go clang, or would the brick sail straight on through as if that thing were a mirage? Well, I've come to the conclusion that there are circumstances in which it would do both. So what is responsible for that? And as strange as it may sound, that takes us into consciousness territory, because if consciousness is our link, or the link between the human mind and what we perceive as reality, then do we start to look at consciousness, which we don't understand, of course, or at least science doesn't. It doesn't know. It knows what consciousness is, but it does not know how it is formed or processed. Do we look at consciousness as the missing link between what people report they see in the sky that they can't explain, and and some sort of missing component of what we call reality. And that is sort of where I am at the moment. I've left the nuts and bolts of my journalistic job behind, and I've truly jumped down that rabbit hole. And it is, as everyone here will know, that's a whole new journey in itself.
Wow. So on April 19th, coming up in a week or so, less than a week, to jump to current events. The United States Senate on April 19th is having another public UAP hearing, and they're aiming to address concerns about the unidentified aerial phenomenon and the need for more investigation and transparency. There's been vocal advocates for further examination into the phenomenon, and people have been pushing for more funding for the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO. So, with your research into the military black project world, can you explain to us the funding financial model based around that is, which is like the people in public don't really know much about that, and how do you think that that model is going to adapt and change over time in the current financial climate, with the digital dollar rising, etc., and as well as this climate of disclosure and more government officials pushing for funding and transparency?
Okay, so obviously I'm not there, but I keep my ear to the ground. I talk to a lot of friends in and around that world, so the military intelligence world, who do know about this stuff. Of course, it is all shrouded in secrecy, but in essence, as you said, this is all part of a congressional mission to understand what UAP are. When the New York Times broke that story in 2017, and obviously a centerpiece of that story was the Tic Tac incident, things began to unravel quite quickly. The US Navy, which had obviously encountered the Tic Tac, had also encountered, it emerged, a whole range of unidentified aerial phenomena off the eastern seaboard of the United States. And if you talk to a guy like Ryan Graves, who was an F-18 pilot on multiple combat air patrols and training missions off carriers off the eastern seaboard, he will tell you that there would be days when pilots would go up and they would encounter something anomalous every single time they went up. So, that after a while began to get the attention of politicians, senators, and congresspeople. And bit by bit, this, move to investigate what was going on emerged. I'm sort of recapping some stuff here to get to your question. But in 2021, there was a report that came out, which for the first time, and this was a report that was mandated to be delivered, mandated by Congress to be delivered by the military intelligence community. That report revealed for the first time or acknowledged that UFOs were real. It didn't say what they were. It gave a number of possible explanations for what they could be. But what everyone was interested was this sort of almost ignored by the report bucket of sightings, which were the ones that we've been talking about. Things in the sky that were doing such strange maneuvers they could not possibly have been done by anything terrestrial. So that then evolved into a hearing last year, in May last year, which was the first public hearing, and we're now moving to a second public hearing And there is in the background this question about Arrow, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. I may have got that slightly wrong, but it is the body within the Pentagon that has been set aside to investigate all of this stuff as a sort of central clearinghouse within the military community for all of these strange sightings. I think that we are going to find next week a great deal of frustration on the part of the politicians that the Pentagon and the military intelligence community are not pulling their fingers out to move anything like as fast as they should be, or at least as Congress would like it to be addressing the issue at hand, which is, what are these things? Are they a threat? What possible explanations could there be for them? And are they something or things that could not possibly have been constructed by any nation on Earth, and which instead may have come from somewhere else? So what there has been a lot of foot dragging by the military-industrial complex, and I think that politicians, well, anyone who watched the last show almost a year ago will remember that the display that was put on by the two senior intelligence officials who were sort of called in to do a show and tell to the committee that they spoke to. I mean, it was painful to watch, really. It was sham-like. They both fumbled over the facts. They were pulled up politely by the committee members and, asked to explain what they meant. And there was a film of an object that was, laughable, really, in what it showed. We all know, at least, those of us who speak to people behind the scenes know that there are many more high-resolution, faithful images of unidentified flying objects that they could have shown to the committee members in Congress, which they didn't. But all of that led to a kind of bubbling frustration in Congress, and on a bipartisan level. This is not a partisan issue. This is, both sides of both houses are saying, we want to know what is in America's skies. And I think it's only been exacerbated since the shoot down of the Chinese balloon in late January, early February, and then the other three objects, which still remain sort of unresolved, unacknowledged, and buried in terms of what was actually seen. I think the sensor imagery and sensor data is still classified, and my betting is it will remain so. So all of this, there is this bubbling frustration amongst politicians that they are not being given the facts as they are asking for them. And whilst in decades gone by, people have gone, well, that's fine, because this is a taboo subject anyway. And, it's okay if it gets brushed under the carpet, in part because counterintelligence has done a really good job of making it look, or, back in the day, making it look like a, subject that only, cranks and loons would get involved in. And politicians are now saying, thus far and no further. We've had enough. We want to know the truth. Now, the question then becomes, do the guys who get pulled up as witnesses, are they going to call time and go, okay, it's a fair cop, we'll tell you everything we know? Are they going to say nothing? Or may they go for a sort of partial disclosure, which is to partially lift the veil of secrecy, say, yeah, you know what? These are real things. They are phenomena we don't understand. They are also, we think it's unlikely that all of them come from this neighborhood, this planet. Maybe they might even go so far as to say this space-time. So I think anything and everything is up for grabs next week. I'll be as interested as the next person to see what is said. And I'll be particularly interested to see how the witnesses handle it, because there has been, over the last year, I'd say, perhaps a little bit less, 9 months, a real walkback campaign by the Pentagon, the military intelligence community, and even by Arrow itself, this office set up inside the Pentagon to study the phenomena or the phenomenon, and again, Congress is saying, we have asked for funding for Arrow. We have asked that it should be the central clearing house for this phenomenon, and yet it appears as if each branch of the armed forces and the intelligence community are continuing to do their own analysis behind closed doors and not feeding that data into Arrow, which is what they should be doing. So, yeah, all of that by way of saying it's going to be a very interesting show next week in Congress on Capitol Hill.
Oh, nice answer, Nick. Appreciate it. What do you think about this Arrow, for example? Say if the House of Lords or the House of Commons were to talk on this and make it an official program also in the UK? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, here am I, mainly a Brit, a quarter American, saying, there's foot dragging going on in the US. Well, what you guys are doing over there is infinitesimally more than what we are doing here. I mean, it is as if everything that you've been going through in the last 5 years has sailed this country by. There are, I'm tempted to say, no questions in Parliament or the House of Lords or wherever about this subject, which is, to my mind, is incredible given the way that you have opened up the debate over there. And there should be. Do I think that, it's being ignored over here? No, I don't. I'm absolutely convinced that behind the scenes, people within MI5, MI6, the Ministry of Defense, and any other body with an intelligence remit is going to be fascinated by what is happening over there. And let's not forget that this stuff does have a defense implication. For anyone who has not read UFOs and Nukes by Robert Hastings, I urge them to do so. It is the most phenomenal compendium of UFO/UAP sightings over nuclear installations and around nuclear weapon sites, and over history. I mean, over decades. I mean, since the explosion of the first atomic bomb in 1945, and the interest, or perhaps that's not the right word, but the apparent interest that UFOs, UAP display when it comes to these sites, whether they are nuclear power plants or nuclear weapons storage installations or ships and other platforms that carry nuclear weapons, is manifest. It is, it's undeniable. And Robert Hastings has assembled this, fantastic collection of evidence. And so it's not as if there is no defense implication in all of this. There is. Are these things hostile? Well, we don't know. Should we be studying them? Absolutely, we should, because they are showing, or appear to be showing, a great deal of interest in us. So other countries too. I mean, NATO countries, Five Eyes countries. Five Eyes are US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Those other countries, apart from, actually, Canada has a pretty strong interest in the whole UAP subject. But us, the Australians and the New Zealanders, are appearing to show a marked disinterest in the subject. But as I say, I think behind the scenes that is not happening, and they are as interested as the next person is.
Perhaps it's because of the reverse engineered programs being so in abundance, because there's so many different shaped craft. In your book, you went in on the Bell, the anti-gravity craft. That was the advanced German technology, the Nazi technology. And they were seen allegedly in all parts of the planet, including Antarctica. And I'm just wondering on how many different craft do you think that there are, and how many of those are actually focused around the 0-point energy G engine technology?
If I could reframe that question slightly, which is
Absolutely.
to go, I think we have to question, as I said earlier, whether the variety of forms that people see are truly all nuts and bolts craft. If we are dealing with some aspect of consciousness or some aspect of manipulated space-time, which is in some way shifting and altering our reality, or at least how we perceive reality, then there would be any number of manifestations of things that people see in the sky. And, one of the things I have a great deal of trouble with, and this is as a former analyst of military technologies, particularly aerospace technology, I can't get my head around why, if these things are all coming from other planets, or even if they're being secretly developed here on Earth under some, top secret anti-gravity program, why are we seeing such a proliferation of different craft types? And why also do we see them with such regularity? And one of the real showstoppers for me about, whether this was top secret terrestrial technology, which is what I wanted to believe, by the way, when I set out to write The Hunt for 0 Point, because that was my background. It was to look at secret nuts and bolts military tech. One of the things that couldn't allow me to come to that conclusion was because in following the data of those, early top secret sightings in the 1980s around the Stealth program, which, I was talking about earlier. The problem with that is that you wouldn't, or no one in their right mind would test that technology over a population center. But that's what, plenty of people say they see over cities, as they see UFOs and UAP over cities. That makes no sense from a secret government testing point of view. It simply doesn't. So the other question then about, so why do we get that proliferation of types, and why do we get them so frequently? I really think boils down to that question about consciousness and reality. It may be, if we begin to perceive our reality as not the hard, solid, material world that we think of it as, but as something much more malleable and manipulatable than we customarily think of it as, or for that matter, actually, as mainstream science thinks of it as, then you can begin to formulate other ideas. For example, if reality is a screen on which we project our innermost conscious collective thoughts. I mean, think Carl Jung here, who talked about the collective unconscious of humanity as a sort of soup in which we humans, exchange psychic ideas, psychic symbols, psychic notions, and we project them onto this reality screen. Then suddenly there are all kinds of non-physical possibilities for what UFOs can be. Now, in amongst all of that, I think we have to view this as a spectrum of possibilities. And at one end of the spectrum, there is going to be some top secret, man-made craft that we have no knowledge of yet in the white world. Then there will also be, I have no doubt, some extraterrestrial vehicles, some technology that has allowed alien entities to travel here from distant star systems, who occasionally turn up. But the vast majority of sightings could be something quite else, something that is so alien, strange to our way of thinking, that we can't really begin to conceive at this point in time what they could be. But, I think since we are now, everyone seems to be saying there is no question but that we are dealing with a phenomenon. The mere fact that we have had in the last few years, one open hearing in Congress about this, and next week we're going to have another, is admission in itself that this is a real phenomenon that no one can duck and ignore anymore. So once we've got past that, we have to start to look at this plethora of different explanations for what it could be. And, let's hope that mainstream science jumps on board, because, I was trained as an investigative journalist. I was trained to rule nothing out, nothing in, until all the facts had been assembled and the data had been scrutinized and analyzed. That doesn't seem to be always how mainstream science operates. There are whole areas that it will refuse to acknowledge or even look at, because it is, quotes, strange, or it is, anomalous. And because some of it, particularly around the psychic domain, shows a marked reluctance to be repeatable in experimental laboratory tests, that is a big no-no for science. If it's not repeatable, it can't be a real thing. So it just discounts it. And I think it discounts it because, of course, it taps into whole scientific reputations, whole departmental reputations. And it also taps into that, most fundamental thing of all, which is funding, which, if you stand up and you talk about this stuff and you're not cleared to do so, and it is taboo, then someone somewhere will turn around and go, you know what? We're going to cut your funding because we think you've lost the plot. And that is so wrong in this day and age. And I'm, hats off to the members of Congress who have opened this up, because as with any taboo, once you start talking about it, and initially you start talking around it, and then you start talking about it, bit by bit, that taboo falls away. And I think we will be getting very rapidly to a point where all of this stuff is going to be on the table. And good, I'm looking forward to that day, because it is so mysterious in the main part that we need everyone, whether they are the military, whether they are the civilian scientific community, everyone, to be looking at this and trying to figure out what it is.
Wow. Thank you, Nick. I was wondering, has anybody ever, like, what haven't you been asked yet? Like, what is it, something that, you've never really spoken about before, something that, you think, would be, something that basically nobody's ever asked you before? Like, what is it? Is there anything that you want to talk about that you have never done so, or put in a book, or said on any other like show you've done?
Well, I'll tell you what. It's a good question, and I'll tell you what comes to mind is. So when that New York Times story came out in 2017, I thought, how do I dive back into this in a way that is meaningful for me? Because, I'd read a lot of literature, and there are, many authors who have investigated and written about UFO phenomena that I admire. One of them is Jacques Vallée, whose books, really opened up that whole question of, that sort of interface between the hard nuts and bolts aspect of UFOs and the psychic aspect to them as well, all linked through this mysterious domain of consciousness. So I thought, if I'm going to sort of meaningfully dive back into this and investigate it, or at least, engage in it, this is after, as I said earlier, this massive gap. When was it? 2017? So, sort of 15-year gap of not looking at it at all. I thought, I've got to approach this from the other direction. I've looked at it already from the nuts and bolts direction, and that really came from the Hunt for Zero. It resulted in the Hunt for Zero Point, the book. But I've got to come at it from an altogether different direction. So I need to understand, or at least get myself up to speed on consciousness. In 2014, my wife had this really sort of, for me, it was a sort of paradigm shifting experience. And I didn't experience it, she did, when her mother died. And I was in the room when it happened. And at the precise moment her mother died, my wife, who was holding her mum's hand, experienced this thing that typically people who experience a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience talk about, where they're in an alternate reality where time sort of seems to stretch infinitely, everything is connected, there is this sort of substrate that is filled with what they call love, that is, perhaps symptomatic of everything being known and connected. Anyway, that's the experience she had. And I was so perplexed by this. And of course, we've been married a long time, so I know her very well. She doesn't make things up. I researched it, and I found out that it was something called a shared death experience. And lots of people talk about that. There are books you can read on it. But being annoyingly curious, I had to go off and research this some more. And I did. And that got me into the whole sort of domain of consciousness. And because I wasn't professionally involved in that side of things, the only thing I could do, and I felt a need to discharge it, was I wrote about it in fiction form. So I wrote a thriller called The Grid, which came out at the end of 2019. And that really sort of, for me, tackled this whole subject of consciousness head on, but in a fictional form. I have to say, though, that I think that much of the content of the book is based on what may really be happening out there in the real world of dark secrets. But after that book came out, I still sort of wasn't satisfied. The itch hadn't gone away. I still had to dive into this deeper. And I then, through a series of extraordinary connections, I got funded by a philanthropist to go away and study consciousness. And so within the space of about a year and a half or 2 years, I'd sort of done the equivalent of a degree course, or maybe a PhD in consciousness studies. And I then thought, well, now what do I do with this new knowledge that I have? And of course, consciousness is something that you can study endlessly. So, I'm always going to be investigating it or looking into it. But I think it was the beginning of 2020. No, maybe it's 2021. Robert Bigelow, a billionaire hotel tycoon who is in Las Vegas, who has been intimately connected to the UFO story for decades now. He launched a competition, an essay competition, that underpinned his new venture, which is called BIX, the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies. And because I had all of this data about consciousness, I felt that I was able to give the exam question a go. And the exam question was, provide the best evidence for proof of the survival of consciousness, our consciousness, after permanent bodily death. In other words, do we go on when we die? So I entered this competition. I knew I was up against some huge names in the field of consciousness. I had no hope of getting anywhere, but to my enormous surprise, I ended up with a consolation prize. I was one of the 29 winners. So I went to Las Vegas and picked up my prize. And then a few months later, so this was the beginning of last year, Robert Bigelow offered me a part-time directorship in the research field at his institute. So now I am very happily and slightly, I still have to pinch myself a bit, I'm rubbing shoulders with all of these amazing brains who are investigating consciousness. And of course, Robert Bigelow in his previous life, I mean, not literally, I mean, before he was investigating consciousness, he was all over the UAP phenomenon. So I feel I'm sort of now in the right place insofar as this is where my investigations into consciousness have got me, and it is a truly fascinating realm. And I think that you cannot look at the UFO phenomenon without looking at the consciousness phenomenon as well. I think when it comes to what those members of Congress are doing in looking into it, that right now is a step too far. To begin with, you've got to go through the sort of the due diligence, and the due diligence is, to begin with, let's look at the nuts and bolts stuff. Let's look at what's making radar returns above those sensitive military installations. Let's look at those pieces of sensor data we're getting back from our combat aircraft. Let's look at that stuff first and see what we can make of that. And then when we are used to doing that, let's then open it up a bit and look at what those other explanations might be. To wit, is there a consciousness connection? Is there some manipulation of the fabric of reality going on that explains or partly explains all the weird stuff that comes with UFO sightings? And anyone who's familiar with the law will know that, it's not uncommon for a host of truly bizarre manifestations to come alongside a UFO sighting, to wit, ghosts, poltergeists, cryptozoological creatures, think Skinwalker Ranch, and you're kind of there. But that is a step too far. At this juncture, it is enough at this time that we're just looking at, I think, the hard and fast nuts and bolts stuff, and we'll tackle the weirder stuff, what Jacques Vallée calls the high strangeness of all of this a bit later.
Bigelow and Dr. Collier described that as the precognitive sentient phenomenon.
Yeah.
Which inspired the name Tesseract for our podcast.
Good. Well, I'm in the right place.
So, Nick, we have 4 minutes left now. Is there anything you want to close out with?
Not specifically. Obviously, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think we are truly, I'm not given to sort of bold statements. I prefer to be quite sober in my treatment of all of this. But I would be really surprised if in the next year, maybe two, actually just maybe even a lot sooner than that the whole edifice around this subject crumbles. And whilst we're not going to get it all at once, I think we are going to get bits of it. And, it's sort of, once you start peeling away the layers, it's going to be very hard to stop. We then, Lou Elizondo has talked about this. The next question is, how do we ready ourselves mentally as a species for knowledge that we may not be alone, not just in the universe, but on this planet? We may be sharing our 3/4 dimensional reality with a 5th dimensional reality or a 5th dimensional intelligence that is here, and it's doing stuff, and it is able to somehow act with agency in this world. And I think all of that is to come, but, we'll start with baby steps. And I think in the next, months, year at the most, 18 months tops, we'll begin to hear about some extraordinary revelations. And I think we are definitely living in interesting times. And I'm there with everyone else wanting to know what's going to happen.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Nick. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Amazing. All right. Thank you, everybody. This has been Nick Cook on Tesseract episode 3.